And for more, we cross to our correspondent Jack Barton, who's closely following the proceedings in Geneva. Welcome, Jack. So how likely is it that the Syrian opposition will actually attend these talks?
Well, Edwin, at the start of last week, when the talks were delayed, we had many diplomats saying that these talks would collapse before they even begun. And throughout last week, it certainly seemed that that might be the case. But then the United Nations, which is brokering these peace talks, took a bold gamble. They decided just to move forward, begin the negotiations in the hope that other groups would feel perhaps excluded or locked out, and therefore put the pressure on them to come in and join the discussions. And it worked. That's exactly what happened. After saying they wouldn't attend all last week, this group that is based in Saudi Arabia, the largest coalition of opposition forces fighting the government, or the forces of the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, have now arrived in Geneva, and they are expected to join the talks later today. Though, as you mentioned, they're still saying they're not going to negotiate directly with the Syrian government until certain preconditions are met, like the end of aerial bombardment. But they will come and talk about things like humanitarian aid, and that alone is seen as a welcome, or it's been welcomed warmly by the United Nations, who see this as a very positive step forward.
A Syrian opposition group already in Geneva for the United Nations brokered peace talks welcomed the news that the main Saudi Arabia-backed coalition had finally decided to attend.
Because we cannot speak about our point of view from Riyadh. And I didn't understand up to now why they are not here.
The opposition group, calling itself the High Negotiating Committee, had previously refused to attend until the Syrian government and Russian Air Force stopped attacking rebel positions. The UN's envoy on Syria said the best way for the HNC to achieve that goal would be by joining the talks on Sunday.
We have been strongly suggesting to them that the best way to actually discuss the implementation of such type of discussion, and therefore of improvement, is to be done here.
Opposition groups also want Kurds from the Democratic Union Party, known as the PYD, to attend.
The Security Council's resolution asks for every strand of the Syrian opposition to take part in the negotiations, and we are a very serious strand of that opposition. We are an historic opponent of the regime.
Ankara does not want Syrian Kurds involved because of their alleged links to Kurdish groups fighting for independence in Turkey. The UN says for now Kurds will attend as observers.
The United Nations has been trying to invite the broadest range of participants to these talks, though extremist groups like ISIL have been excluded, even though they still control large parts of Syria.
The UN is giving the talks 6 months to achieve a peace agreement that could lead to a transition government and elections. The first goal is to get all sides to agree to a ceasefire that could halt the bloodshed and allow humanitarian aid to start flowing through a country that has been torn apart by 5 years of civil war.
Edwin, I mentioned the Kurds and the fact that Turkey considers them to be a terror organization, wants them excluded from these talks. But all of the other opposition groups want the Kurds included. So does the Syrian government. The Kurds control a large area of that border between Syria and Turkey, and they have been some of the most effective fighters when it comes to dealing with ISIL, a group which is excluded from these negotiations. So there is still a lot of talk of including them at some point. It's seen that these negotiations can't really move forward without them, but for the time being, there's just a few of them here as observers to the discussions.
Well, they have, as you mentioned, Jack, 6 months for these talks, and even if the relevant parties don't actually face each other, and you make the point also about the ceasefire being an immediate goal, what are the chances of the talks actually being deemed a success?
At this point, it's all still too fragile to tell. This is the third day that the talks will be going ahead. That's right. The way the United Nations has tried to set these talks up is that so they have a much greater chance of success than the past two rounds, which collapsed almost immediately, but still it's going to be very difficult. That's why they've set this up as proximity talks, where nobody actually faces each other in the same room. They'll be in separate rooms with Staffan de Mistura, the UN's point man on Syria, as well as his team shuttling between the rooms. Even so, he has warned that we should expect walkouts. We should expect a lot of posturing between these parties, and we should expect delays. So we shouldn't see these as setbacks. The UN will keep trying to move this forward. It's also why they've given that long time frame, a minimum of 6 months for the talk, but beyond that, another 6 months to find an interim government, and beyond that, a year for elections. So at the very minimum, there's going to be 2 years before the desired result is found, and it's likely to be even longer than that. But immediate terms, it's just that ceasefire. The biggest stumbling block to that is the fact that the Syrian government forces are still recapturing lost ground. And President Assad has said there will be no ceasefire or no talk of any further concessions as long as his forces are still recapturing lost ground. But the lost ground they're recapturing is mostly in Latakia and provinces that have a strong Alawite community. That's his own religious group, the dominant religious group of the government and the army. So while they're fighting in these areas, they're likely to make big successes with that renewed Russian air cover. But once they move beyond that into Sunni-dominant areas, it's going to be much more difficult. That could take weeks, it could take months, but when that happens, that's likely going to be the time we really see talk of a ceasefire gathering momentum.
All right, Jack, many thanks indeed for that. Jack Barton there reporting on these ever so important talks from Geneva.